Welcome everyone to our COP28 Debrief Academy session. We are glad to see many of you connected, and we'll just give it a minute for additional participants to connect, and then we'll get started shortly. Again, a warm welcome to everyone who just joined this COP28 Debrief Academy session of the UN Global Compact. My name is Anna Krüb. I'm Senior Manager for Environment and Climate at the UN Global Compact, and I will be facilitating today's session. So let me start with a few housekeeping remarks. As you can see on the next slide, this session is being translated simultaneously into French, Spanish, Portuguese, Japanese, and Turkish. To activate simultaneous translation in your language, you can click the interpretation button in the control bar at the bottom of your screen, and then choose your language. And then finally, you can click on Mute Original Audio button, so you only hear the translated version of the session. The recording of today's session, along with the slides that we will be going through, will be shared with all of you via email within a few days. And during the session, we will make time to answer some of your questions live, and we'll also respond to questions in writing throughout the session. So in any event, please use the Q&A feature to submit your question, and also upvote the ones you would like to hear answered if somebody else has a question that you find interesting. You can find the Q&A also in the control bar at the bottom of your screen. So now that we're all set, let's look at the agenda for today's session. First, we will hear some introductory reflections on COP28 before shining more light on the key outcomes, the Global Stocktake or GST, and the perspective of the private sector. You will hear from a variety of speakers today, including myself, and I'm delighted to welcome on the next slide Joyce Mendes, member of the UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change, Fernando Castellanos, Head of Environment and Climate at the UN Global Compact, Annette Möhner, who is supporting the Global Stocktake at the UN Climate Change Secretariat UNFCCC, and Justin Parrottson, Head of Sustainability and Partnerships at Novozymes. Before we get started, we want to learn a bit more about you and your perspectives on COP28. For this, we will be using Mentimeter, which my colleague is pulling up on the screen right now. You can access the Mentimeter either by going to menti.com, type in this code that you see on the screen, scan the QR code that you see on the screen, or click on the link in the chat. And feel free to stay connected to Mentimeter, as we will be using it throughout the session. And I see participants connect. I'll give it a minute for everyone to connect by either the website, the QR code, or the link in the chat. And here comes our first question. It's an easy one. Did you attend COP28 in person? Okay, we see answers are still coming in, and it's great to see that we have a few colleagues here who were part of COP28, but most of you weren't. So we are really hoping that this discussion and the insights that our speakers will be sharing will be of interest to you. So that's perfect. Moving on to the next Mentimeter question. This is a bit more about your perspective on the private sector's contribution to COP outcomes. So less than a week after COP28 concluded, how do you feel about the role of business in driving credible change? And I see the answers coming in. Most people see both sides of the coin in a way, neither optimistic nor disappointed, but in a way, a mix of both. And going a little bit more into detail on the background of your answers. What were you disappointed by at this COP? This is an open-ended question, so feel free to type a short answer in the Mentimeter. We are seeing not going far enough, inaction by governments, the location sponsors, big oil, fossil fuels, oil lobby. That is something that's coming up a lot. lack of actionable items, no real results, to also look at a few points that might have been positive from the results of the COP. I'm switching the question now to ask, from your perspective, what are the most positive outcomes of COP28? And again, that's an open-ended question for you to contribute to. More inclusive. There was an agreement, which many at the end wouldn't have thought was possible. Discussion on coal, focus on health, food systems on the agenda. It finished. Yeah, many of us were very happy about that. The loss and damage fund, of course, mention of fossil fuels in the agreement, inclusion of fossil fuel mentioned, that's top of mind for many of you. But also there was none, no positive outcomes. Youth presence, tripling renewables. Perfect, thank you very much. Great to kind of set the scene with a bit like a broad perspective from the participants at this session. So it was really good to hear from all of you. Without further ado now, let me give the floor to our first speaker. Joyce, over to you.
Thank you, everybody. Sobae Shapa, hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining this session. And it was very interesting, the results as well of the survey, and perhaps just drawing some perspectives from COP, but also from your answers. Yeah, I think there were big items that were discussed, especially when it comes down to energy transition. We saw the importance about right, tripling renewables, doubling the energy efficiency capacity as well. On other important topics, as it was mentioned, the loss and damage fund, we have, like these big items happening, but at the same time, and the question that I also want to ask you is how we are going to localize these items back to our communities, back to our countries, and back to our realities, right? We understand that climate action, we have these global frameworks, but at the end of the day, the action as well is national and local. And we see we require a lot of innovation. When we talk about energy transition, we're not just talking about changing from fuel, but also having a revolution in the full system, in how we understand actually a full life assessment of, let's say we're talking about a solar panel. And so, but also there was a huge discussion on just energy transition. And I think this is very important when we think about the business and the industries, where we think about the people, the planet, and prosperity, right? And so when we talk about this innovation as well, it's not merely technological, but also society, so social innovation, financial innovation. We need different as well frameworks to be able to apply and to really still commit to the 1.5 Celsius degrees. I remember at the beginning at COP, there was a study that we got, like it said there was, we had still just 15% chance of reaching the 1.5. And I think we still have to keep even pushing it more, because we're not talking about just, degrees and temperature, but we're talking about people's lives. We're talking about the future generations and these generations' rights as well. And then I see as well as a momentum again after this COP. We have next year as well the national commitments of the NDCs, the submission and the update of the same ones. And at the same time, we also have some of the results of the Global Stocktake. And as you said, during this COP, we saw a lot of participation of civil society, of youth, a lot of people just participating. But we cannot just have these results there. And we have to start again this new year really applying and really transforming people's lives. And also, perhaps I want to bring a reflection, especially from my case. I'm a social entrepreneur. I work as well with the water, food, and energy nexus, especially in food security in the triple border of Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina, which is kind of the heart of the Mercosur business and food production. And I believe that when we think about how business and industry can impact, the question is not just how can, but how they will impact as well this full transition and climate action. Especially responsible business models are fundamental, right? Again, to localize, to apply climate action, and to understand that profit in a prosperous planet, they should not be antagonic roles, but also how to think that your industry and the role of business is fundamental, right? In transforming different perspectives. So I also want to perhaps leave you with a question that is something I keep asking myself as I see, especially among young people, I see when you say the word entrepreneur or business, sometimes I feel like, okay, we don't want to work necessarily with you, or we just think about all the time about the government responsibilities, but it's also about the legacy. We are in this age, right, of climate crisis and several other crises happening. So that what is the legacy that you want to leave with your industry, with your perhaps business model, but also how you're going to be a good ancestor, if perhaps that's not so deep question, but how do you want to see the future as well, generations to see you and to see your leadership and your actions? So I have more questions perhaps than answers, and I'm really hopeful to see what we're going to be reaching globally, especially with the time limit that we have, but we have a lot of resources. We have these platforms where we can share good practices. So again, enjoy this session. And please really think that this is just kind of the beginning. We need to push more for climate ambition. And I believe the private sector has such a great space for innovation approaches. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, dear Joyce, for kicking us off with your perspective, both as a member of the UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate, but also as an entrepreneur and bringing in, as you said, the need to localize climate action, bring back the outcomes of global conferences such as the COP into communities and countries. And I invite everyone to kind of have that question in the back of your mind while we go through the session. What's the legacy we want to leave as individuals, as representative of a certain company, and how can we be a good ancestor? Thanks so much for setting the scene for us. Yeah, and for everyone joining us live, please do go ahead and submit any questions you have to us or to our speakers through the Q&A function. We have colleagues on our end responding live, and we'll also take some time at the end of the session to discuss some of your questions. Next, I'm now happy to hand over to Fernando Castellanos to walk us through the main outcomes of COP28.
Thank you very much, Anna. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. So I'll just go quickly through three aspects from COP28. First, we'll look at some of the headlines in newspapers we've seen, in the news, in different media. We'll look into a few of the specific decisions, the things to look out for, some of the decisions adopted by the COP, and some of the work that has progressed and the work that will be going on over the next year. And then we'll touch a little bit about the importance of private sector engagement in the process and in driving climate action. So in the headlines, what probably most of us have seen is the outcome in relation to the transition away from fossil fuels in energy systems. How this has been really a new set of words that have a deep meaning for the private sector in particular as the main driver of climate action, and how this sets a policy direction at the international level that needs to trickle down to the national policies and regulations. We've also seen in the news how new funding has been pledged for the Green Climate Fund, the GCF, standing at around 13 billion US dollars. We also saw some progress in other funds, the LDC fund, the Least Developed Countries Fund, the Special Climate Change Fund, the Adaptation Fund. And this is just a little bit of what's needed in terms of climate finance, but the fact that many countries have come forward with such significant pledges, it sets has set the process in a towards trust building, towards achieving progress little by little. And as we see also some headlines not being not so positive, looking at how for countries to reach consensus, they often look for the minimum common denominator. What's the least that can be agreed among such a diverse set of countries? However, this can also be looked into in a positive light, that most, if not all, of the international community wants to address climate change in one way or another, and how to get there, it's what's really difficult in these negotiations, whether some countries focused on emissions or on fossil fuels. It is clear that countries really do want to engage in climate action, but they have different circumstances, and that's what makes the negotiations quite difficult. And these are obviously also the things that will attract media, will come in the news, but there are several outcomes that also achieved progress. Under the COP, we also had the adoption of a series of decisions, such as the ones mentioned here, a work program on just transition pathways, which had a number of elements to look at the various dimensions that are necessary for a just transition, looking at the various socioeconomic aspects, the social aspects that are critical to achieve a just transition. We had progress on the Sharm el-Sheikh Mitigation Ambition and Implementation Work Program, where countries agreed to look into future global dialogues and investment-focused events to enable effective engagement of participants. And here we hope to work with the business sector as the UN Global Compact to bring your voice into these dialogues and events. So we'll be working closely with the Climate Change Secretariat, with the COP presidency and the incoming COP presidency, to see how we can ensure that business is engaged in this work program. We also saw progress in the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage. There were a lot of there was quite significant progress here, starting with the sort of a remarkable achievement at this COP, where a decision which has been regarded as the first time it's happened, a decision being adopted on the first day of the COP, approving the arrangements for the new Fund on Loss and Damage, which is a significant milestone. The COP also selected a host for the Santiago Network on loss and damage, and hopefully that will kickstart more work on this issue for the benefit of SEEDs and LDCs, small island development states, and least developed countries. We had also progress on the technology mechanism, approving a 5-year work program that will promote technology development and transfer. On the financial mechanisms, there was guidance to the GCF, the Green Climate Fund, and the Global Environment Facility, the GEF. And countries will continue working on a new collective quantified goal on climate finance, which is a key issue, and where, as I mentioned, from the headlines, that those pledges for the GCF help build that trust in having this quantified goal on climate finance. We also saw some progress, although countries didn't reach a decision in terms of climate action on agriculture and food security. There was an informal note with the elements, including workshops, information sharing. But this is a critical issue for all countries, not only the most vulnerable countries, but every country has these are critical aspects, and we're also many in the business sector have a key role to play, to engage in, and to bring solutions that will benefit the population globally. And as I mentioned, it is critical to have the private sector engaged in the COP, in the process, not just looking at the COP as an event, but as a process, engaging where possible in work programs, in groups, in providing inputs to committees, in bringing the private sector view and needs into the discussions? How can businesses be a positive force in driving climate action? What is needed from the private sector in terms of guidance and policies that will spur investments, enhancing public-private partnerships in these dialogues to really foster innovation, to really foster the technology development and transfer that will set the world in the right directions to maintain the 1.5-degree goal. So the private sector has many solutions, has resources as well, but these need to be leveraged in the discussions, in the programs to achieve progress. I believe many of the private sector participants at COP were there to showcase what they are doing and what they can do, provided the right incentives are there. And the governments globally can leverage the private sector to enhance the delivery of climate finance and make sure that it is not just public finance that we rely on, but as we need trillions to address the climate challenge, most of these will need to come from the private sector. But for the private sector to invest, they also look into the policies necessary for them to make the right investments for all in benefit for all their stakeholders and in the countries and regions where they operate. So with this, I would leave it now. I thank everyone for engaging in this session, and hopefully we can engage with all of you throughout the year to ensure that we bring positive inputs to the climate process in the near future.
Thank you very much, Fernando, for these insights. And yeah, now let us dive into the global stocktake that Fernando also mentioned, and that was top on everyone's mind this year. But first, we want to hear once more from all of you through Mentimeter, including to get an idea which of the issues Fernando raised resonate most with you, as we are really keen to engage with all of you in the next few months. So to go back to the Mentimeter, either you're already connected or you can use the link, the QR code, or the link in the chat. And the question we have is, which of the following topics are you most interested to engage in the following year? And that includes national climate plans or NDCs, agriculture, water, just transition, emission reductions or mitigation, scaling up renewable energy, climate adaptation, and public-private partnerships. So I give this a minute to load. A big majority is very interested to engage further on emission reductions, which is of course a super important step to take to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. Public-private partnership comes second, which I think is just telling from here, having a webinar with you on Global Compact and private company representatives. Scaling up renewable energy. We have talked a lot about the goal of tripling renewable energy. So that's, of course, something that the private sector plays a crucial role in, as well as NDCs and national climate plans. Thank you very much. Very, very good insights. Feel free to keep the Mentimeter open on your device as we will get back to it. And now I'm really happy to invite Annette Möhner from UNFCCC to take the floor and explain to us what the Global Stocktake is, why it's important, and what happens next. Annette, over to you.
Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you for inviting me to sharing some insights from not only COP28, but also the last 2 years. And if I could have the next slide, please. Basically, if you look at the Global Stocktake itself and why it is important, it was actually built into the Paris Agreement when it was adopted in 2015. And some of you may still remember the Kyoto Protocol, which was the previous agreement, which actually had a different setup. Basically there, governments decided in order to limit warming to a level that would not cause harm to humankind, you actually put a cap on everything. And then developed countries were asked to reduce their emissions. However, developing countries were exempted from it. So for the Paris Agreement, countries decided to agree on 3 global goals. The one most known is the temperature goal, where countries are striving to minimize global warming to 2 degrees, ideally to 1.5. And the other 2 global goals relate to adaptation, to ensure that within the temperature increase, we ensure that ecosystems as well as economic systems are able to adapt. And finally, the 3rd goal relates to finance, insofar as countries are striving to ensure that financial flows are being consistent with low greenhouse gas development. And in the Paris Agreement, while we have these more aspirational goals, no country itself assumes a specific target. On the contrary, everyone contributes to the global target according to their national circumstances and capabilities. And the Global Stocktake comes in to actually ensure that every 5 years, countries are able to take stock of, have all the national contributions combined been able in their totality to achieve the global goals. And this was the very first one. So we checked whether or not the combined emission reduction pledges from countries enable the global temperature limitations to be there. However, while we could deduce that the Paris Agreement is working, and yes, the temperature increase is not as high as it would have been without the Paris Agreement, we're still not on a trajectory. The latest reports point us towards up to 2.8 degrees, which according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is still way above what any economic or human system can withstand. So yes, it is working, but it's not working at the pace that is required. So over the course of the last 2 years, not only have we understood that the Paris Agreement is not working at the speed, but also countries have realized what needs to be done in order to basically course correct and keep 1.5 within reach. And if I could have the next slide, please. So what does it tell us? Yes, we need to do more of what we have done, and we need to do it faster. And it is important in a way that we need more specificity. As said, the Paris Agreement only gives these very aspirational goals. It tells countries that they have to limit global warming to 2 degrees, ideally 1.5, that they should be net zero by the turn of the century, but it didn't really give concrete targets. And likewise for adaptation, the goal was to enhance resilience and to reduce vulnerability, to keep up with the temperature increase without necessarily saying how so. So why the Global Stocktake and the outcome that was negotiated in Dubai is important is that it actually puts targets on the table. On the one hand side, we have now targets for mitigation, and Joyce already mentioned the tripling of renewables. We have doubling energy efficiency, but we also have transitioning away from fossil fuels. If you look at the outcome further, there's also a provision to reduce the non-CO2 non-CO2 emissions like methane. There's also a provision to try to ensure that the transport sector reduces its emissions. There are provisions to ensure that we halt deforestation in line with what was agreed under the Biodiversity Convention. At the same time, mitigation is just one aspect of the Global Stocktake. It also speaks to adaptation, insofar as for the first time you'll see targets that relate to infrastructure, that relate to water, that relate to agriculture, but also to call on parties to ensure that they plan for adaptation, that they actually implement these resilience plans, and most importantly, that they actually monitor and evaluate. What we've seen over the last 20 years is a plethora of plans, but hardly any implementation, and what was worse, not a lot of M&E towards the end. So the idea is that the Global Stocktake leads to to basically closing the circle, that we're basically learning from what we have done in the past to ensure that we're doing better in the future. When it comes to finance, you'll see that the results there, besides the pledges, are still less targeted. One of the reasons is that there's a bit of a we're not in sync with the finance discussions. You may have heard of the $100 billion goal that developed countries agreed to mobilize $100 billion per year. They're hopeful that this goal had been met, but next year is the time when countries will look at how do we get from the billions to the trillions, and that will come next year in order to ensure that all these climate plans that are now being updated will actually be implemented. So in terms of what is next, we now have concrete targets for mitigation, for adaptation. We will have concrete finance targets next year. The question is, with those targets, how can countries in their own national plans contribute to these targets? And that is the next round of NDCs, which are due in 2025. The decision itself puts a number of capacity building activities. There will be workshops where countries can exchange lessons learned, look at good practices, but we also put in place a number of follow-up mechanisms where there are dialogues where countries can share their experiences on what they have learned from the global stocktake, not only in their national decision-making, but also how they have involved stakeholders, be it business, but also the local communities, civil society, so that at the end it is an all-of-society effort to contribute to the global goals on basically dealing with climate change, adapting, but also reducing emissions in the future to come. So while it is a 5-year process, it is clear for everyone that we cannot wait another 5 years to see whether or not we manage to keep 1.5 degrees in reach. But we have put in place a number of processes that allow us every year to see whether or not countries are doing what they're supposed to be doing, and in case they are not able to look at mechanisms to enhance their capacity to provide the necessary support so that collectively countries are able to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. And with that, I would like to thank you and hand over back to Anna.
Many thanks, Annette. And yeah, I think with your contribution, you already answered some of the questions that I saw coming in the chat. Like somebody said that, isn't it like obvious that we are not on track? Like, why do we do the global stocktake? And I think what you pointed out is that it's not only about looking where we stand, but learn from what we have done in the past to ensure we are doing better in the future. And thanks as well for kind of describing those follow-up mechanisms and dialogues for experience sharing. We also had like someone in the Q&A box point out, like we cannot really wait another 5 years to do this again. It's like, aren't we on a shorter timeline? So thanks for pointing out that there are a number of processes every year to both check where countries stand, but also to offer support. We will now switch gears a little bit and talk more about how the decisions taken at COP impact the private sector and how private sector impacts those decisions. For this, I want to first hear from you, so get ready to connect again to the Mentimeter. Our first question to all of you is, do you feel that the outcomes from previous COPs have translated into policy frameworks in your areas of operation that encourage your business to take positive climate action? And we are seeing the results coming in similar to our one of our first questions. It's a mix of both for most, and quite interestingly, the yeses and nos also kind of are in a balance, with a few more people thinking that it hasn't quite translated into policy frameworks, while others see the results in their countries or where they operate. That's of course also a question that will look quite differently if we would break it up by region, I assume. On our second questions, before we go into the next segment, as we have heard, all governments must now prepare for the next round of national climate action plans or nationally determined contributions, NDCs, for 2025, so coming up in only 2 years from now. how can the private sector contribute and positively influence NDCs? And that's, again, an open-ended question. So really looking forward to hearing from you. Don't greenwash. Yeah, I think that's a good first step. Drive by example, energy reduction, invest in renewable energy. The answers come in so fast that I can almost not read them. So it's great to hear all of those ideas. Policy advocacy, having a collective voice, but also share data, change your business model, no greenwashing again. And there should be a mandate from the government, which I guess brings home the point that only by working together, we can really move forward faster. And here we also hear it's not the private sector's role to influence the government, but the other way around. So really need the strong signals and regulations from the government, and take action. Yeah, with this, I'm happy to wrap up the Mentimeter. And we wouldn't want to speak about what the COP outcomes mean for the private sector without hearing from a company representative himself. So let me hand it over to Justin Peretson of Novozymes to share his views on this year's climate conference. Okay. Justin, over to you.
Thanks, Anna, and a huge thank you to the team from Global Compact for all their work on ground and also for caring for climate. And it would be remiss of me not to also thank UN Climate Change and the UNFCCC for their amazing efforts, not just at COP, but over the last year in particular. I always like to say that COP is actually a 52-week process rather than a 2-week process. It just happens to culminate each year at a COP. I think just in terms of some opening remarks, pretty much this COP in particular, I think it has, amplified the opportunity for the private sector, firstly, to engage, and secondly, to collaborate across a number of issues, a number of industries, and even more importantly, with all stakeholders, because that's really what's going to drive us forward. I think if you look at the outcomes of COP itself and what's called the UAE consensus, so UAE consensus is about 31 different documents that you need to work your way through. So from a business perspective, how do you sort of look at those elements and pull them all together? Fernando, I think, has given us a fantastic overview of the main elements within this. If I was to pick up on a couple that I think are really worth focusing in on, and it's been touched on here, particularly NDCs, nationally determined contributions. If you read through the Global Stocktake documentation, it will tell you, yes, they are due to be signed off in 2025, but they are also due to be delivered by the end of 2024. So the next COP, to give time to actually review them and try and ratchet and accelerate them upwards. So this engagement process with the private sector in particular, in terms of the art of the possible, what's feasible, and what we can do if we actually work together becomes really, really important, especially in terms of not just the infrastructure, the innovation aspects that the private sector can also bring in, but also this idea of public-private partnerships, which really do need to be all of society and all of economy if they're actually going to deliver, because I think it's been said beautifully by Joyce already, at the end of the day, this is about people. And, a business cannot operate or succeed on a failing planet. So whatever's good for the climate needs to be good for the company. It needs to be good for its customers, and it needs to be good for the communities in which it is working. So absolutely, I think priority one moving forward needs to be nationally determined contributions 2024. How do we get that framework in place to really help secure 1.5? Because I think the science tells us, and we've seen the tension, particularly those of us at the COP, that 1.5 is probably at more risk than it's ever been. And if we don't do something in the next 2 years, we're going to negatively influence, arguably, the next 2 centuries. So how do we get that piece right? Secondly, I think within the Global Stocktake, it's always great from a private sector perspective to actually see reference to business, industry, the private sector. That certainly wasn't the case with the Paris Agreement, but since then, you've seen a lot of businesses really try and step up and into this space and figure out what this means for them and how they can contribute positively. Again, I think within that space in particular, with a COP, it's always difficult. It can be glass half full or glass half empty. But I do think, and it's been said, that the signaling that's been given around the transitioning away from fossil fuels, the tripling of renewable energy investment, the doubling of energy efficiency, that tells a business which direction things are heading in. And that, of course, over the right time horizon is really, really important when it comes to sitting down and making your investments. Two of the other issues that I think one's already been touched on, I'm just going to say a couple of words on it. Food systems and agriculture has been a long time in the making in a climate context. I remember because I actually attended the one and only side event back in Paris on agriculture. There were 25 people and that was it. I think if you fast forward to this year, the amount of attention that has been placed on agriculture and food systems is absolutely correct, because it's approximately a third of the problem and a third of the solution. And it's one of those areas that really does impact your humankind, and you can really feel and see it. It's very difficult for those in that space not to get, on occasion, I would say, very emotional about it, because it is so connected to all of us. So I think certainly I would be both optimistic and hopeful by the time we get to Bonn next year that there's a further step forward on that. The other area I think that's really important for business is on carbon pricing and carbon markets. And I prefer to refer to them as greenhouse gas emissions markets, because they also cover things like methane. Again, methane at this COP in particular has received much more attention than it has done previously. Where we still need to see some progress is on Article 6, which is the governing mechanism for so-called carbon markets and carbon pricing under the Paris Agreement. We're still not quite there in terms of how those markets are going to operate between countries, and also how they're going to create that global framework for business and industry to start investing into this space. And I think that is going to be a key issue in the short term. And when I say short term, over the next 6 to 18 months, that really needs to be resolved if we're going to get this financial underpinning put into place. There's been a word on technology already. I think that is also really important in terms of the technology mechanism, because within that space, of course, it's not just about pure tech transfer. It's also about empowering and facilitating the use of technology. So things like artificial intelligence have also been called out for the first time. There's some really groundbreaking work that's going on, trying to make sure that all technologies are available for use and deployment, be it for adaptation or mitigation around the world. So again, I think that's a really important driver that's come out of this process. I think also you see the drivers, particularly from a private sector viewpoint, again, in terms of what this means around behaviors and how this process is going to be driven forward. Again, from a technical perspective, and again, with kudos and credit to the UNFCCC and to UN Climate Change, there's been a huge amount of work done on what's called the Enhanced Transparency Framework, which again is a process to really open up the insides of the climate change process, to understand better what NDCs mean, and also to show where potential collaboration exists between parties and observers in this process. So again, I think that's a really important point. There's also been, of course, quite a lot of conversation. Greenwashing, of course, has come up on the list of topics that people have raised in terms of what will happen next around the high-level expert group report and some of the recommendations contained within that. So again, I think it's incumbent on anyone in the private sector to really try and drive this with, all best intentions, with as much openness and transparency as they can possibly muster. But I think also recognizing that, unfortunately, climate change progress isn't linear. We would love it to be, but there will be some bumps on the road along that way. But I think it's also creating the trust and confidence between different stakeholder groups to show and document and demonstrate that we're all driving in the same direction. We're certainly not going fast enough. I think COP28 has put us a step in the right direction, but we really do now need to start running towards the next 2 COPs in 2025 in particular.
Thank you very much, Justin, for these words. Really interesting to hear your perspective on the role of technology on carbon or greenhouse gas emission markets, and a step in the right direction, which we should switch into running speed. So let us run into some Q&A. I know that colleagues have been answering some of your questions live in the chat in writing, but we will also be able to give the word back to our panelists. So I'll invite Joyce, Fernando, Annette, and Justin to come back with their videos for a couple of questions, and I'll just put them to the group and invite you to come back. So we have one question from Caroline that I found quite interesting, which is, do you think we are experiencing a specific moment of engagement on the sustainability agenda right now that tends to weaken over time, or do you think it's here to stay on companies' agenda? How do we maintain and maximize this engagement on sustainability? I don't know who wants to go first. Please feel free to unmute and share your perspective.
I'll go first, and but I believe it is not if it is a moment, it has been a long moment of engagement from the private sector in sustainability, and this has evolved, and hopefully will continue evolving in that countries see the benefit to the usual triple bottom line, people, planet, profits, and so companies, I believe, will continue to be engaged. They see it's necessary. They have both impacts and dependencies on nature, and ultimately depletion of resources or having greater impacts from extreme weather events and the effects of climate change will affect also businesses. So I believe the continued engagement of companies in sustainability will be there, given their need to continue if water resources are depleted in a certain region where the company needs such water to produce whatever they may be producing, then they would need to relocate, right? So they need to make sure that they're taking care of the resources available to them.
Yeah, thank you so much, Annette and Justin. Please feel free to
Maybe to add what Fernando has said, I think the moment is there, and it also started, if we look at some of the sister conventions that climate change has. We had a good outcome of the Biodiversity Convention last year, where for the first time they also agreed on targets, 30 by 30, basically ensuring that 30% of land is protected by 2030. So we see a rallying of various agreement around targets leading to 2030. And of course, on the one hand, people realize that if we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, which all speak to 2030, that if we do not do sufficient climate action, we will not be able to basically meet those targets. So in a way, we're seeing also concerted efforts across different agenda, whether it's climate, whether it's biodiversity, whether it's development. And that also translates beyond the intergovernmental process, but it sends signals to also the investment communities, the multilateral development banks, to call on them to reform themselves and to ensure that any lending does not go into unsustainable and climate unfriendly practices. So I think it is important that it comes together. And looking at some of the question, 1.5 is still achievable. And the science has spoken that, yes, the window is there, it's narrowing, but we do have the technology. And if countries put the political will where it is needed and redirect investments, it is possible. And then we would not only ensure that we stay 1.5 degrees, but that we also ensure that we meet the Sustainable Development Goals. So the question is whether we continue the current business as usual model, or whether we actually do divest into more sustainable development practices. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Annette. Justin, you also had your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to share one of my favorite anecdotes. One of our then chief financial officer was asked exactly this question, why are you guys, playing around with this sustainability and climate stuff? And he just responded, he said, you know what, my analysts might not care, but my investors, they do. And I think particularly what's just been said is really, really important to understand that this is all about a risk-weighted, risk-adjusted future, be it from a private finance or a public finance perspective. I think you certainly see that with the messages and noises coming out of the World Bank and IFC lately, with some quite interesting and innovative thinking around blended finance and concessional finance, recognizing that this is a global issue. So you need to bring both the global north and the global south along. I think also, you know, had you said last year to people that there would be progress on plastics and there would be a biodiversity agreement and, you know, basically outline what was in it, most people would have taken that with both hands. I think we're in a quite similar situation with this COP. There's actually probably more to unpack than a lot of people realize, but it's this particular realization from the financial community that this stuff is serious and this stuff is going to change the way that they invest over time. And the fact you've got a lot of businesses that are now, I like to use the expression enlightened self-interest, really understanding what this means for them. It's not about the next quarter, it's about the next century, and getting those two pieces to line up. I think it's also very fair to say, again, from a company perspective, that the easy part of climate change is now over. We're all in this for the long term, which means we need to be very sharp, very specific. You know, business plans need to align. A lot of investment needs to flow. But I will say, and again, thanks to great people at Global Compact and elsewhere, that there is a very hardcore of the business community that's been scaled up, that understands not just the size of the challenge, but the scale of the opportunity. And I think it's those two elements that need to be brought into play.
Thank you so much. And we have another question here that many of you have upvoted. It kind of addresses the paradox of conferences with that many participants like the COP. Was it worth to have 80,000 delegates from all over the world flying to Dubai to discuss how to reduce carbon emissions? And for this question, I would like to hear from you, Joyce, if you don't mind, kind of your perspective on what can be an added value of having so many people come together, who should be there, and how you lived it when you were on site.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thank you for the question. And perhaps I'm going to reply on the perspective perhaps of civil society and youth, as well indigenous peoples and vulnerable communities. I have been following COPs for kind of the last 5 years, and I have seen that not necessarily just the increase of the amount of people, but also like to have different representativity, and also to have certain vulnerable peoples not just participating in because besides the negotiation, there is a lot of things happening. And what I also saw is just civil society, youth, women, indigenous peoples as well, trying to exchange good practices, trying to even get support, even having meetings as well with private sector, the government, having like try to really catalyze the action as we, you know, and we understand, and there are many countries that really do not have the time. So I saw, and I was really surprised not just to see that, you know, people were there, but they were really busy. They were really, you know, engaging with different stakeholders. And I think this is very powerful. And then that also raises questions, especially for my region, for Latin America, where we're thinking, wow, in 2 years, we're going to have COP in Brazil, in the Amazon, in Belém. Probably we're not going to be able to host a conference for 100,000, you know, people. Perhaps every COP also have different kind of logic perspectives and different priorities. And I know this is also a challenge as well for our region. And we also use that momentum as well to enter in contact kind of with the governor of Belém and to try to, you know, try to understand what is going to be left after, you know, a big conference as well for the peoples and for the city as well. What is going to be the impact? And, you know, like there's been some increase on financing about like water and sanitation, especially in Brazil, in that region. So it's going to have a positive impact. And in the other hand, I also believe that we saw and we still see the amount of lobbyists for fossil fuels. So if we have as well civil society participating, and also we have, again, other kind of peoples participating, I believe that this is very important as well to bring, again, different perspectives, different realities, and also to, you know, call out. And I saw during the first hours of COP, it was very stressful because there wasn't completely an agreement, but I also saw the pressure that civil society was doing there. And I think that was fundamental as well for this decision and that word as well on the final outcome. Yeah, that will be my perspective. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joyce, for sharing. And unfortunately, we are already reaching the end of the session. So before concluding, let me go through a few key takeaway actions, and we will pull the slides back up for that. So for once, of course, continue to follow key negotiations and engage in resulting working groups, in programs, work with peers, with workers, with communities to tackle challenges, include civil society, as we just heard, push local and regional governments. We have seen in various comments and questions that, of course, both the private sector and governments cannot do this alone. So we need to create an enabling environment and show at the same time that businesses are ready and willing to cooperate. And then, of course, also carry out any existing commitments and report on robust targets, kind of linking back to that discussion we just had on maintaining the momentum when it comes to corporate sustainability. And when it comes to commitments and targets on the next slide, I also wanted to make sure to invite you all to join Forward Faster, which is an initiative the UN Global Compact and a broad range of partners have launched this part September. And Forward Faster calls on companies to take action in 5 areas: living wage, gender, water, finance and investments, and of course, climate action, and advocate for enabling policies to advance the SDGs. And now one last time to wrap up, please join me on Mentimeter to share what are your organization's priorities within the context of climate action for 2024. I just give it a minute for everyone to respond. So we're seeing investing in nature-based offsetting, another -5 degrees greenhouse gas reductions, science-based target setting, deliver what we have committed, emission reductions, eliminate gas as a heat source, community engagement, energy transition, renewable energy, a lot of comments on the energy part. Also measure and show emission reductions in supply chains, which I think is, of course, the dreaded Scope 3, but which for many companies is such a huge part of their emissions. Decarbonization that they comply with legislation as well, better monitoring and evaluation. And these are, of course, very important and ambitious goals. So with our last question, we wanted to ask you what type of guidance, support, and signals from governments, the UN system, and other companies do you need the most to take these actions? That's, of course, a pretty broad question, so feel free to pick 1 or 2 examples. But what would you need from governments or the UN system or other companies to address those goals? Sector roadmaps for companies, clear regulations, financing, funding, of course, easy access to project funding, standardized data as well to make it easier to monitor and evaluate, as we just heard, policies that are transferable into reality, legally binding regulations, policy stability. Yeah, I think that's, of course, very, very crucial. Education, scale up renewable energy and subsidize them, and people, regulations, fundings. With that, I'll want to wrap up. I think that's actually a great way to summarize people, regulations, funding. And many thanks to all of you for joining and to our speakers who shared their expertise today. For many of you, this session is part of a longer climate journey that provides a learning experience across key issues such as just transition, science-based target setting, and climate adaptation. And for those of you who are not yet signed up to the journey, we invite you and colleagues to join us today, and then you will get access to additional curated sessions to help take your action. And last but not least, we are very interested in getting your feedback on today's sessions as we constantly strive to improve the value of the experience we provide to you. So you can find a link to a quick feedback survey in the chat. Many thanks in advance for your feedback. And so, yeah, many thanks to all of you. Wishing you a very happy new year, and to all who celebrate a warm and wonderful holiday season. Thank you.